Good morning. We start with shock new claims of torture in Ukraine. Sky News has visited towns recently recaptured by Ukrainian forces near to the Russian border and has heard claims of how the occupiers punished residents. We also spoke to one soldier who told us that it wasn't just the Russian military, but that local police were collaborating with the occupiers to carry out the torture. Our defence and security editor, Deborah Haynes, reports now near the Ukrainian-Russia border, and a warning her report contains descriptions of alleged torture.
Russia's invasion is going backwards in parts of Ukraine. A powerful tank towed off the battlefield like a plough. It's a very different route from the one used to enter, like this railway connecting Russia with Ukraine. Nothing running now, after Ukrainian troops recaptured territory right up to the border. But they've not yet secured the peace.
This sign says that the border with Russia is in that direction. It's about 2.5 miles down the road. The Ukrainians have retaken control of the border crossing point, but it's still coming under direct Russian fire, and we've been told it's too dangerous to head there at the moment.
In the towns and villages closest to Russia, an eerie quiet, in between the sporadic shelling. There are suspicions not everyone here in Vovchansk is sorry Russia's occupation has ended. A soldier who's accompanying us is keen for the man to answer our questions. The house sits next door to this place. It used to be the main police station until the Russians came.
I'm outside what was, until just a few days ago, a Russian base here. Behind me, that was a Russian military checkpoint, and on the floor are a number of old Russian newspapers. This one here, dated the 9th of August, with a headline that rather fittingly reads, "Ukraine promises counter-offensive."
The occupiers appeared to have controlled by fear, punishing those sympathetic to Ukraine.
В агрегатний завод, отак, мішок на голові, за руки, і там і били, і питки током. Сюди, сюди, куди? По 10-20 днів. Некоторих до сих пор невідомо де.
This is the site. Police are investigating the torture claims, so we weren't allowed inside. In a nearby village, the soldier introduces us to his family. They couldn't see each other during the occupation, making moments like these all the more precious. The father shows us marks from where he says he was detained and tortured with electric shocks, but not by the Russians. Instead, he says it was local policemen who chose to collaborate with the occupiers and wanted answers about a theft.
І коли вони скочували мене, сказали, скочуйте йому очі плотніше, щоб вони не повипадали від току. Казали, зараз у тебе випадуть і волосся. Почали бити током.
With the village back under Ukrainian control, those police officers apparently fled to Russia. But the sense of betrayal lingers. Deborah Haynes, Sky News, near the Ukraine-Russia border.
Sally joining us now from the capital, Kiev. Hi, Sally. Can't even begin to comprehend, as if these poor people didn't have enough to contend with. Now they're having to deal with collaborators.
Yeah, that's right, Kay. It's important to remember there's deep suspicion on both sides here as Ukrainian forces liberate areas of the country, as we've seen in the northeast in the last couple of weeks. They're finding civilians who've been through unthinkable pain during 5 to 6 months of Russian occupation. But of course, there will be some people who chose not to evacuate those areas because they're either pro-Russian or at least Russian sympathizers. And certainly President Zelensky in his nightly address warned those people that they now face a choice to either flee the country or face the full force of the law. Now, Ukrainian forces are said to have made more advances in the northeast overnight, liberating a town just 6 miles west of Lysychansk, Kay. Now, you may remember back in July, that was a subject of fierce fighting for weeks. So for them to have got that close to an area in Luhansk, in the eastern Donbass region, is significant progress indeed, certainly at a point where many expected there to be this grinding war of attrition going into the winter. And of course, a strong message from Liz Truss today as she goes into her first international meeting as Prime Minister on the world stage over in New York. That the UK's support for Ukraine will remain unwavering, and she's pledged to give the same amount of military aid and funding to Ukraine next year as we did this year, which was estimated to be around £2.3 billion, the UK's contribution second only to America's. And certainly Ukrainian forces are trying to make the point that this military aid and these weapons being given by international partners are making a huge difference here.
OK, Sally, thank you. Joined now by the new Culture Secretary here in the studio, Michelle Donnellan. Hi, good to see you. Good morning. 2.3 billion is what Liz Truss is promising. Again, where's that money coming from?
We're the second biggest military donor, and we are committed to doing that again next year. We'll outline exactly the details of where that funding is from, but we believe as a government it's fundamentally important that we're standing up for democracy, that we're continuing to protect Ukraine in their fight back, and that we're standing up for the rest of the world who needs to end their global dependence on Russia, which is one of the factors behind the increasing price in fuel. So this is actually going to help the cost of living of people not just in the UK, but across the globe as well. And we hope that other countries will see what we're doing and follow our example.
But where's the money coming from?
As I said a moment ago, Kay, we will outline exactly where that money is coming from, but I'm sure that you agree with me that this is vitally important. I'm not going to preempt the Chancellor's fiscal event. The fiscal event is on Friday. I'm not going to preempt exactly what he's going to say in that event, but we'll be outlining there more support in terms of cost of living, looking at taxation, like we promised during the campaign to secure Liz Truss as Prime Minister, and all the details will be coming out on Friday.
The reason our bills are so high is because of the war in Ukraine. How high do those bills have to go before we have to reevaluate our support?
No, this isn't about our support this year. This is about saying that we are going to continue our support next year,
but that's not
just
my
as much
question.
In terms of the Ukraine.
Yeah,
if you're talking about support for people in a country, we've already given considerable support. So we put the money into the Household Support Fund. We also gave the money on council tax. But what we've announced as a government that's only just been in post for 2 weeks with this new Prime Minister is an energy price guarantee where we are assuring the British public that they will get at least £1,000 off their energy bills had we not acted. And that's on top of the other measures we've taken. In the coming months, people will get £400 off their energy bills, irregardless of their income. The most vulnerable in society will be getting at least £1,200. So you've got to look at the package in the round. There's a great deal of support that we've been putting in place. We've always been honest that this winter is going to be hard. And one of our overarching priorities is to support people through it, whilst also growing the economy and preventing this from ever happening again.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't explain myself very well. My question is, the reason that bills are going up as high as they are is because of the situation in Ukraine.
It's a big driving factor, yes.
Yes, so how high do our bills have to go before we reevaluate our support in Ukraine?
Well, I don't think that is the case. We're not reevaluating our support in the Ukraine. What we're saying is we're doubling down on our support in the Ukraine.
So how high do bills have to go? It doesn't matter how high they go.
Well, no. So we've already allocated £2.3 billion to support Ukraine in terms of the military effort. We're the third biggest supporter in terms of humanitarian effort. What we're saying in this announcement is our support for next year. We're committing again to support the Ukraine by the same tune. And we're encouraging other countries around the globe, and that's what the Prime Minister will be doing at the UN General Assembly, to ensure that we're all working together to support the Ukraine to help bring those bills down, which are also up because of COVID as well, as you know.
Yeah. What's the Prime Minister going to be talking to Joe Biden about, given that a trade deal's not on the table?
Well, I can't go into details of exactly what the Prime Minister will be talking about in a bilateral meeting, but what I can say is that will be happening this week. It's in the diary. UK and the US have enjoyed a very special relationship over the years. We want to cement that, solidify that, and make sure that relationship is completely fostered between both of those leaders.
But looking at what Liz Truss, our Prime Minister, has said, it doesn't look as though there's a trade deal on the table.
Well, look, the Prime Minister and the President will be meeting this week. They'll be talking about a variety of different issues, including potential trade deals. So let's see what comes out of that meeting.
Not according to Liz Truss. She said not.
Well, yes, so I'm saying they'll be talking about a range of different things. The purpose of this meeting is not to secure a trade deal. This is the first bilateral meeting between the newly elected Prime Minister and the President of the United States.
Talk to me about the Queen's funeral. How much did it cost the taxpayer?
We haven't got that total figure, but I think the taxpayer would argue that it was money well spent. In my own constituency, I saw so many people coming out to celebrate for the Jubilee across the community. And in DCMS, the department that I lead, we've been leading on the efforts around the queue, and that was remarkable. And not just in terms of the amount of people.
How many people queued? Do we know?
So over 250,000 went through Parliament. We're just crunching the final numbers. So that's an approximate figure at the moment, Kay, but we'll get back to you with the exact one. And it wasn't just those people. It was also the community that rallied around that. We had St John's Ambulance supporting, we had the Samaritans supporting, we had the Red Cross supporting, we had members of the public coming up with, items of cake and food. And it was a great sense of the community coming together. I always think of our late monarch as the glue that brought society together and communities together. And in her final sort of act, that's exactly what she did. And it was remarkable to see that on the ground. Having spoken to members in the queue, they'd come from afar all over the four corners of the nation, and they felt determined
and
to
beyond.
wait. Yeah.
And beyond.
Indeed.
So more than 250,000. When will
Approximately.
we... Yeah, more than... yeah. When will we know the cost of the funeral, given that we don't know it yet?
Look, I'm not sure of the exact costings, but as I said, I think the British public, would argue that that was money well spent. You saw so many thousands out there, and I don't think anybody could suggest that our late monarch didn't deserve that send-off, given the duty and the selfless service that she committed to over 70 years. I think it would be downright preposterous to suggest we shouldn't have celebrated her.
I'm just asking
service.
how much it cost.
Yeah, so I've said I don't have those figures to hand.
But we will have it in the fullness of time.
So that wouldn't be my decision to take,
okay.
Kay.
OK. Talk to me about when you were at Education. I mean, you weren't there very long, were you?
Well, I was there for over 3 years.
Yeah, as the Secretary of State, how long were you there?
Yeah, well, as you know the answer already, Kay, it was 36 hours, but I was serving in the Cabinet for 10 months, and before that, Minister in 2 different roles, so I was there for over 3 years.
OK, £17,000 is what you got, apparently, as a payoff.
As you know the answer to that one as well, Kay, I didn't take that.
OK, so you said that you were going to give it to a charity?
No, I didn't. I said that if I wasn't able to reject the money, I would give it to a charity, but I rejected it.
Oh, OK,
as you already know.
OK, I didn't know that. That's why I asked you the question. OK, I was surprised you didn't give it to a charity, but there you go.
Well, it was taxpayers' money, so I think it would be wrong for me to take taxpayers' money, then decide which charity I wanted to give it to. So I was very clear that if I was able to reject it, I would reject it, and I did.
OK. Talk to me about the online harm bill. Where are we going with that?
So it's a vital piece of legislation. It was in our manifesto. As we know, the world has changed remarkably, and it is important that we prioritise protecting children. Having spoken to a number of parents and organisations in this sector, it is important that we fill in the gaps in our legislation and protect children, which is what this bill does. So we're going to get it back to Parliament as soon as possible, finish it off. It's been through most stages.
That for a long time. I remember interviewing the Chief Exec of Ofcom more than a year ago, and it was supposed to become law last year. Still waiting.
Well, it's gone through most of the stages. As we've just elected a new Prime Minister, we've had a period of national mourning. We will be bringing it back to the House as soon as we possibly can. It does require a little bit of work, not in relation to protecting children online. Absolutely not. We're not changing any of that. But we want to make sure that we've got the balance right in terms of free speech in relation to adults.
So when will it become law?
As I just said, as soon as possible, we bring it back to the Commons, and we do need to edit that bill. So we're just in the process of getting that done, and then we'll be bringing it back. Of course, we couldn't have done that in the last 10 days because we had a period of national.
Yeah, you've had plenty of time before that.
Yes, but I've only been in post 2 weeks, Kay. And what I'm saying to you today is I'm committing...
Secretary before you, though. It's not as if there was no one in post.
What I'm saying to you as I sit here today is that I'm giving you my cast-iron guarantee that I'm committed to this. It's my number one priority. I'm going to make sure that the bill is slightly tweaked, bring it back to Parliament as soon as possible, because I completely understand why this is a vital piece of legislation to protect children online.
Do big tech companies do enough to protect our kids?
I think that the problem is that it can be inconsistent and they aren't always held to account on this. So the answer is no, which is why we're bringing forward legislation to ensure that they do.
When you say held to account, which ones in particular hold them to account?
Well, that's why we're bringing forward legislation to give us the ability.
About.
Well, this bill is primarily focused, it is focused, providers that generate online content. So a lot of that is social media providers. You know, we've got the inquest starting today in the absolutely tragic case of Molly Russell. And we all know that she is just...
Let's just remind our viewers, she was 14. She killed herself as a result of online harm back in 2017. I mean, are we looking at... people like Facebook, people like Twitter, they need to, Instagram, they need, of course, Facebook, they need to be doing more.
But they do need to be doing more, which is why we're going to legislate to ensure that they do, so that we have not only the legal powers to do so, but also we can then whack them with massive, massive fines, which then is a big deterrent and ensures that they act in a responsible way from the off.
Will you abolish the BBC licence fee?
So I've only been in the post 2 weeks, but what I can say is over the last few days, the BBC did a tremendous job, as did Sky, in covering a very poignant moment in British history as we celebrated the life of our late monarch. But it is no secret that I have been a long-term sceptic of the licence fee and that we need to make sure that the BBC is sustainable in the long term. So I'm looking at this in the round. I'm somebody that listens. I'm somebody that decides policy based on evidence, and that's what I will be doing over the coming weeks.
Yeah, you pointed out that although you were only in post 2 weeks, you've been in government for many years. I'm sure that the BBC licence fee has come up on occasion. Do you think it's time for it to be scrapped?
I think we need to make sure that the BBC is sustainable in the long term. As I've
What
already said.
What does that actually mean?
Well, it means that in an age when you have Netflix, you have Amazon Prime, you have all of these other subscription-based channels, then it does throw into question whether the current model that the BBC uses is actually sustainable in the long term and is providing that choice element to the general public. But as I said, I'm somebody that listens. I make decisions based on evidence. That's what I will be doing over the coming weeks. I'm not going to make policy on the hoof. I don't think that's the right approach when we're looking at these big policy decisions.
OK, good to talk to you. Thanks for
you.
taking the time to join us. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Looking at the front pages for you this morning, most of them leading with the Queen's funeral. The Guardian shows the coffin with the headline, "The Final Farewell." That same picture is on the front of the Mirror with the words, "Until we meet again." And the Express also carries the image and says simply, "God rest our Queen." The FT shows King Charles and other members of the royal family following the coffin out of Westminster Abbey. On the front of the Metro, we see a full-page picture of the funeral cortege making its way to Windsor. And the procession moving down the long walk outside Windsor Castle is on the front of the Sun newspaper, while the Times has a photo of the coffin being carried into St George's Chapel. Still to come on the programme for you this morning as we hear fresh allegations of torture in Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine. We'll speak to a former UK ambassador to Ukraine, that's Lee Turner. With the government preparing to deliver its plans to tackle the fuel crisis this Friday at 8 o'clock, I'll speak to Labour's Shadow Financial Secretary to the Treasury, James Murray. And with millions of disabled people to start receiving £150 payment to help with the cost of living today, speaking to the Director of Communications, Advocacy and Activism at the charity MENCAP as they question whether it will be enough. Well, from today, as just saying, about 6 million people with disabilities will start to receive that one-off payment of £150 to help with the cost of living crisis. But campaigners and some of those receiving the money have told us it doesn't scratch the surface. Here's Aisha.
Katie is a full-time carer for her husband, Mark. He suffers from a rare form of motor neuron disease. Most of the equipment and care he needs to stay alive runs off electricity. It means as a household, their expenses are higher than ever and still rising.
As a disabled family, you need more energy to keep your home warmer so that a person doesn't get chest infections, for example. Might be that you need extra fridge space to hold drugs. You might be using an electric wheelchair and having to power that. So it's things that we can't cut back on. It's not like we can just throw on an extra jumper.
Katie's husband is one of 6 million people who will receive a one-off disability cost of living payment of £150. But she says it's not going to be enough.
The £150 won't really scratch the surface. I'm really worried that that's going to go in an instant. And I'm burying my head a bit in the sand at the moment, thinking about, how long that will last.
This worry will be shared by many people living with disabilities. Concern around the support on offer is widespread.
At the very least, we believe the disability payment of £150 needs to be doubled. We know that disabled households are struggling. We know that £150 has gone nowhere near the size of the amount of money and financial shocks that disabled households are facing. So at a minimum, we want to see that doubled.
In response, a government spokesperson said, in addition to this one-off payment, we will continue to provide a strong financial support system for people with disabilities and their carers, including personal independence payment, universal credit and carers allowance for the millions affected. Extra costs these families are now facing are unavoidable. What they so urgently need is more help, not to fund luxuries, but to access basic necessities. Aisha Zahid, Sky News.
And I'm going to be speaking to the Director of Communications, Advocacy and Activism, as I said, at Learning Disability Charity MenCap. That's Jackie O'Sullivan, a little later on in the programme. Looking at some of today's other headlines for you, though, now. And Joe Biden has arrived back in Washington following the Queen's funeral. He'll join dozens of world leaders, including the Prime Minister, when they address the United Nations General Assembly. The US President and Liz Truss have a bilateral meeting scheduled for tomorrow. It's Liz Truss's first foreign trip as Prime Minister. On the plane, when asked about trade deals, she told us there aren't any negotiations currently taking place with the US and none are expected to start anytime soon. 5 people have been killed during violent protests in Iran over the death of a young woman while she was detained for allegedly violating strict hijab rules. Police said 22-year-old Masha Amini had a heart attack and was taken to hospital while waiting with others held by the morality police, but her father has accused the police of being responsible for her death. 8 years after his case came to global attention through the Serial podcast, a judge in the United States has quashed the murder conviction of Adnan Syed. He was 17 years old when he was sentenced to life in prison in the year 2000 for the murder of his girlfriend, Hae Min Lee. Here's Martha Kellner.
He's the man whose case spawned a wave of true crime as entertainment. Now Adnan Syed is leaving prison, his conviction quashed. The 41-year-old has spent 23 years behind bars for the murder of his ex-girlfriend, Hae Min Lee. But prosecutors say a new investigation has pinpointed 2 other suspects. Syed's supporters are delighted.
I spent 20 years with Adnan. He's a very good friend of mine. I love him to death. It was like a weight lifted off my shoulders to see him released and freed today, knowing that he was innocent the whole time. He's an impeccable human being, just a wonderful person, and hopefully the world will get to see that real soon.
The hit podcast Serial breathed new life into Syed's defence 9 years ago. It cast doubt on his conviction, transformed the true crime genre, and changed how many viewed the justice system.
Chicago, it's Serial. One story told week by week. I'm Sarah Koenig.
18-year-old Hae Min Lee's body was found discarded in a park. Her family say they were blindsided by the decision to quash Syed's conviction.
My clients, all they wanted was information. They want the truth to come out. If the truth is that someone else killed their sister, daughter, they want to know that more than anybody. They were shut out of the legal process by the court and the state's attorney's office, and it was inexcusable. It was a violation of Maryland law, and my clients are exploring their options with regard to appeal.
Fitted with a tracker on his ankle, Syed is now under house arrest. He's not yet been declared innocent. Prosecutors have 30 days to decide whether to retry him. Their next step, and his, will once again be firmly in the media glare. Martha Kellner, Sky News.
The Queen has been buried beside her husband, Prince Philip, after a state funeral and a poignant chapel service as the nation bid a final farewell to Britain's longest reigning monarch. The government has told this programme in the last few moments that more than 250,000 people came to see the Queen lying in state. And late last night, the royal family issued a previously unseen photograph of Her Majesty. The image shows the late Queen on holiday in Balmoral back in 1971. It was published along with a caption from Shakespeare's Hamlet, which simply says, "May flights of angels sing thee to thy rest." What an amazing photograph. Well, it followed an emotional day for grieving members of the royal family, with hundreds of thousands of people lining the streets to catch a glimpse of the procession carrying the Queen's coffin. Our national correspondent Tom Parmenter reports.
The Elizabethan era ended here, in Royal Windsor. The final act of a farewell that matched the magnitude of her reign.
Is not in vain.
They watched in their tens of thousands in Hyde Park, absorbing every detail and what this moment of change means to them.
Charles has got some big shoes to step into, so let's hope he does it and, makes us all feel good about our country.
He's been out to the crowds and people might have a certain opinion of him, but I think he's probably changed a lot of opinions in the last few days.
They've got a place in our hearts that cannot be replaced by anything else. We are a monarchy, we are her subjects and we'll become the subjects of King Charles and then of King William.
Clearing this festival of remembrance was quick. The vivid memories will remain. But life never stands still, especially for a new king. The sympathy and the support that have ruled the first days of his reign will, in time, give way to scrutiny about the cost of all this when some can't afford to eat, and the unity of the United Kingdom, as well as the Commonwealth. And then there is the family itself. The king is known to favour a slimmed-down monarchy, one that offers better value for money.
I think a lot of people are very much like the royal family and the whole royalty because of the Queen, because she is all our grandmothers in theory. How the transition's going to go, I don't know.
In many ways, he's been ahead of his time in conservation, architecture and other events. So I think he will be an extremely good king.
It's such a difficult time where people are really struggling in so many different ways financially. There's so much going on in the world that they can't be completely removed from that, because I think then that people disengage with them.
The crowds will be back for the coronation at some point next year. But the evolution of this most British institution is already underway. Tom Parmenter, Sky News.
Well, official mourning following the death of the Queen will come to an end this morning. Flags on public buildings will return to full mast 12 days after she died. Our royal correspondent Laura Bondock is with us now from Windsor. The royal family still in mourning. Good morning to you.
Hi, Kay. Yes, that's right. Windsor waking up here after witnessing the most incredibly historic day. The Queen buried here, laid to rest finally, alongside the Duke of Edinburgh, and that very private burial, just her family present, and the release of that quite moving photo of her at Balmoral in 1971 with the quote from Hamlet used by the King at Westminster Hall last week, "May flights of angels sing thee to thy rest." And yes, the period of national mourning now over, but for the royal family, for household staff, it continues. In terms of what this means, well, it means we won't see the royal family out and about. There will be no engagements, and flags will still be flying at half-mast at royal residences like here at Windsor. And I think we can all understand and appreciate that perhaps after that really public state funeral and an incredibly busy week, especially for the King, the family will need and want this quiet time for their own private grief.
Yeah, indeed so. And I saw the image of the King yesterday as the national anthem was sung. I mean, he is the King. He does have to take part in a public mourning, but also he's a man who's lost his mother.
He is, and he has been working through the grief, hasn't he? But I think in the statement he released, he was obviously very much comforted by the messages of support. He said that him and the Queen Consort were both deeply touched by the amount of condolence messages they'd received. And when it came to this incredibly busy tour of all the nations, we saw him in Scotland, then in Northern Ireland and in Wales at the end of last week. He said he was moved beyond measure by the numbers of people who had come out to pay tribute to his mother, to the Queen, but also to welcome him as king. So for him, this strange situation of having to lead the nation's grief and lead his family's grief while he himself is obviously bereft and mourning too.
OK, thank you. Thanks very much. President of Brazil, Bolsonaro, has caused controversy by using his trip to the UK for the Queen's funeral to do some election campaigning in London, comparing the price of fuel to how much it costs in Brazil.
I'm here in London, England, and the price of petrol is £1.61. This is approximately £9.60 a litre, practically double the average of many Brazilian states. Our gasoline is, in fact, one of the cheapest in the world.
OK, so that's what he was saying while he was in London. We all know how much it costs, don't we, for a litre of fuel. Here, let's find out what the weather's going to be doing this morning, shall we?
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Rather cloudy, mostly dry. A few showery outbreaks for you are possible.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Let's have a look at what's happening as far as the climate dashboard is concerned. Yep, we have brought it back using a lot more coal today than we normally do. 4.2% of our real-time power mix is coal, a lot of gas as well. It has been chillier, hasn't it, over the last couple of days. I don't really need to talk you through this, do you? I'll do it once. There you go. Global warming since 1880, up 1.25 degrees. That's an incredibly important number. We don't want it to get to 1.5, as we know. And this is the total carbon dioxide emissions in millions of tonnes, that according to the University of Oxford. Nuclear, 14.3%. Officials in Puerto Rico say the country is experiencing what they have called historic flooding caused by Hurricane Fiona. Most of the Caribbean island is without power and water, and 2 people are believed to have died. Forecasters say more than 15 inches of rain has fallen in the last 3 days and have warned the hurricane could strike the Dominican Republic. And more than 130,000 homes are still without power in Japan after Typhoon Nanmadol swept across the country on Sunday morning. 2 people known to have died and at least 87 injured after the tropical storm brought torrential winds and flooded streets in the southwest of the country. After the break, speaking to Lee Turner, the former UK permanent representative to the UN and former ambassador to Ukraine. That to come in just a few moments' time. Hello again, everybody. Very good morning to you. Ali is here, as you can see. We're just hearing that 250,000 people paid their respects as the Queen was lying in state. Department of Culture, Media and Sport, of course, in charge of events. And the Secretary of State was with us a short time ago, also talking about the Prime Minister being in New York at the moment.
Yeah, that's right. So the Prime Minister, obviously, politics has been paused, but it is straight back to business today. She's in New York for the UN General Assembly. And the most interesting part of what she was telling reporters on the plane overnight to New York was about this trade deal with the US. This has obviously been talked about a lot, but we've long thought that the plan for it to happen happen by the end of this year wasn't going to happen. It was going to be delayed again and again. And she has basically said that it's a long way off. She said, I don't have an expectation that US negotiations are going to start in the short to medium term. That was Liz Truss speaking on the plane overnight. Michelle Donnellan wasn't really directly answering your questions about that this morning. She said that we have a special relationship with the US, but I think the implication from Liz Truss is that we're going to focus our efforts eastwards on things like the trade deal with India. But for those who'd been hoping for a trade deal with the US, this obviously isn't good news.
Yeah, I mean, there were more swerves than a box set of Top Gear from her this morning. Talk to me about what she was saying about the BBC licence fee.
Yeah, so I think everyone knows that Michelle Donnellan is a sceptic of the BBC licence fee. We know, of course, that in January the licence fee deal was settled. It's been frozen for 2 years. But she, I think, in terms of the longer-term picture for the BBC licence fee, was making clear that maybe things would have to be rethought. She basically said that it's no secret that the licence fee, that she's a sceptic. She says the licence fee needs to be looked at to see if it's sustainable in the long term.
She's talking about subscription services.
Yeah, exactly. Netflix,
and
Amazon,
the like,
saying that it needs to look at whether it needs to change to keep pace with that. We know that the Conservative government have been looking at this. There's been plenty of people who've been worried about whether the BBC licence fee could have to change altogether, be cut. And I think she's made clear that's something she is going to be looking at.
Alice Take at 9 o'clock.
Yeah.
Looking forward to it. Thank you very much, Steve. Thanks a lot. And returning now to Ukraine, and Sky News has visited areas of the country reclaimed from Russian control, where locals have told us about suffering torture at the hands of police collaborating with the occupying forces. And in his nightly address, President Zelensky had this warning for those collaborating with the Russian military. I don't have that just at the moment, but I can tell you that he's told them if they have fled to Russia not to come back or face the consequences. Joined now by former UK permanent representative to the UN in Vienna and also former UK ambassador to Ukraine. That's Lee Turner. Hello to you, Mr. Turner. Thank you for joining us on the programme this morning. As if the poor people of Ukraine did not have enough to deal with, we're now hearing about police collaborating with the enemy.
It's a very grim picture that we're getting out of these formerly occupied areas of northeastern Ukraine. We've seen this already a few months ago when Ukraine was able to reoccupy areas in the west of the country that had been seized by Russia right at the beginning of this invasion, where we saw all kinds of evidence of human rights atrocities and war crimes. Now we're seeing very much the same picture in the northeast of the country, in the Kharkiv region, where there are mass graves that people are exhuming, literally hundreds of bodies that have been buried in the woods. These are scenes very much reminiscent of World War II war crimes. And we're just waiting to learn more about those deaths, how they came about, whether this evidence does constitute war crimes. And it's very important that these allegations be investigated thoroughly and that those responsible should be brought to justice.
And former ambassador, history tells us, does it not, that where there is one mass burial site, there are likely to be many others?
Unfortunately, we don't yet know the scale of this. These are big areas that have been recovered by the Ukrainian armed forces. They've had a really good run over the last fortnight or so and have reoccupied several key towns and cities that are very important to the Russian occupying forces for keeping their forces in the east of the country supplied. So that's kind of good news that the Ukrainians have had some battlefield successes. On the other hand, it does mean that they're uncovering all kinds of evidence of what has happened during the Russian occupation, and that looks very grim. This story of collaboration is, of course, another difficult aspect of this. If you imagine if the city or town that you were living in was occupied by a foreign government and you had a choice between whether to work with those occupying forces or to resist and face death or torture, what would you do? And clearly for many people in Ukraine, they've had to make very difficult decisions, and that leaves those collaborators, those who did collaborate, in a very difficult position now that Ukraine is back.
United Nations General Assembly, often seen by many as a talking shop, but they are going to be focusing, we hear, on Ukraine today and tomorrow. What are you expecting?
Well, you're right that many of the speeches that are made at the UN General Assembly over the next few days will be listened to by almost no one at all. So the world leaders will get up on the big stage in the main General Assembly, will make their speeches. The value of that can be debated, but away from that main scene, there will be a host of bilateral meetings, of caucuses, people meeting to discuss, amongst other things, and perhaps primarily Ukraine. And what's really important is that the Ukrainian successes of the last fortnight have changed the mood internationally. What that means is that the most difficult thing for the UK and the US and others who support Ukraine has been to maintain Western unity in terms of supporting Ukraine, providing military assistance, maintaining sanctions. That's always been a tough ask when the conflict was frozen and not much was happening. But now that Ukraine has scored some successes, and it's been shown that Russia's grip on the occupied areas of Ukraine can be broken, that has changed the mood. So it's easier to maintain that unity. And on the other side, Russia itself is facing increased diplomatic pressure. We've seen those meetings between President Putin and Xi of China and Modi of India, where there seem to have been criticisms made by China and India of Russia's policies. That's a first since February. That changes the mood. And then we've also seen Russia fire one of its main weapons, which is to cut off the gas to Western Europe. And in fact, since that happened, gas prices have gone down and Russian income from energy sales has gone down and the Russian economy is in more trouble. So all of those things strengthen the hand of Ukraine and its supporters and appear to weaken Russia, although the war's not over yet.
I'm speaking to a very senior military man, former military man, I should say, here in the UK. And he was saying that he feels that there's a 30 to 40% chance that the war in Ukraine could be over by Christmas. What do you think?
Well, it's a fool's game, if you ask me, predicting what's going to happen in this war. I remember being asked this very same question back in February and saying it was very difficult to foresee how this would go, this war. At the time, everybody thought that Russia would win very easily. But the recent war, actually 2 years ago, between Azerbaijan and Armenia, showed that modern warfare had become very much more unpredictable than it had been in the past. And so we have seen with the war between Russia and Ukraine. Russia has really taken a hiding, first in the west of the country, now in the east of the country, against everybody's expectations. I would like to hope that the momentum is with Ukraine and that we might see further collapses of Russian forces over the days and weeks ahead. That would be great if that happens. On the other hand, it's quite unpredictable, and Russia still has considerable forces in the east of Ukraine. We don't know quite what they're capable of, but let's hope that your military source is correct.
Okay, good to indeed, sir. Good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, former UK permanent representative to the UN in Vienna. Thank you. Coming up, as the Prime Minister vows to lift the ban on fracking in England, we're going to be hearing from a professor in carbon capture about the risks involved. That's coming in just a second. Now, Liz Truss has announced the ban on fracking will be lifted as part of plans to accelerate the UK's domestic energy supply. It was banned in England in 2019 after new research raised fresh fears over the risk of earthquakes. Joined now by Stuart Hazeldine, Professor of Carbon Capture at the University of Edinburgh. Hello to you, Professor. Thank you for joining us on the programme this morning. Your thoughts on the decision by the new Prime Minister?
Well, I think obviously the government's entitled to do what they do, but I think anybody trying to venture into this drilling for onshore shale gas or shale oil is taking a huge commercial risk, because you have to ask three questions. Is there a resource there? How are we going to get it out? And what's the effect on climate? And it's clear that the initial estimates by the British Geologic Survey were very, very optimistic, maybe 100 years of resource there. But then subsequent drilling and then particularly laboratory analysis from the rocks recovered from that drilling shows that there's very, very little oil and gas remaining in those rocks. It has been generated long, long ago in the geologic past, but it's leaked away. And so there's no resource there in the vast majority of the UK. There's perhaps just one or two pockets, but there's nothing like the resource originally proposed. There's just maybe a few patches in East Yorkshire. And then, so there's a huge commercial risk of drilling very expensive holes to deep depth and finding nothing. And a lot of people have lost a lot of money already on failed drilling for shale gas in the UK. We also know that the Conservative government in 2019 made a pledge to stop drilling and fracking because there was an uncertain method, no clear method of predicting any earthquakes. And the recent report from the British Geological Survey, leaked out in the newspaper a few days ago, shows that there is indeed no progress been made on that. So there's no scientific basis, no evidence basis to make a better prediction of earthquakes. So companies can go drilling and they'll be liable for any earthquake effects on their boreholes or on surrounding property. And then thirdly, how are you going to get this out? Yeah, carry on.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the impact on the environment.
Yeah, so this needs very specialist drilling crews, which we do not have many in the UK. Mostly this is an American operation, so any extensive campaign will need to bring in people from outside. And to be commercially viable and significant, this needs something like 100 boreholes a year being drilled for a 10-year period. And that's a huge campaign. And none of these sites at the moment have planning permission remaining from the local councils. They may get licensing permission from central government, but that's very different to getting permission to construct a site like is being shown on the screen at the moment, to consent all the truck movements, all the pipelines necessary to deliver water or take away any wastewater. And then lastly, on this, fracking also injects lots and lots of water into the ground to break apart the rock under really high pressure. But when the water comes back to the surface, it's very, very salty. It's contaminated with heavy metal chemicals in that, and sometimes even with natural radioactivity. And that needs treatment and purification before releasing that water back into the environment. And the UK has no significant facilities to do that. So there are huge problems there practically. And lastly, of course, is the effect on climate, that introducing any extra methane production is the opposite of what the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change say, the opposite of what the International Energy Agency say, and the opposite of what the Committee on Climate Change say. So this is a strange and potentially foolhardy venture for any commercial operators.
OK, it's great to talk to you. Thank you for taking the time to join us. We'll let you get on your way. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. New craters have been discovered on Mars after scientists were able to track shock waves caused by space rock.
The chances of anything coming from Mars are 1,000,000 to 1, he said.
Love this music. War of the Worlds? I think so. Jeff Wayne. These spots on the so-called red planet are the first craters ever traced from listening to the impact of meteoroids hitting another planet. NASA's InSight lander, which touched down on Mars nearly 4 years ago, was able to record and send back the seismic waves. If you've never heard War of the Worlds, Jeff Wayne, War of the Worlds, you should definitely listen to it in the car later on today. It's fantastic.